COVID-19 changed the way we work, live, and play. Technology made it possible to work from home, stream entertainment, and connect with family and friends. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. "2020 will be remembered for the countless hardships and loss as COVID-19 ravaged the world. But through it all, technology helped make being separated and human connections a little easier. Children continued their schoolwork online, parents learned to work from home, and many people figured out how to Zoom with loved ones. And when movie theaters closed, entertainment moved online. Audiences are now watching first-run films through streaming services. For more on the technology trends in 2020 and what 2021 will bring, let's introduce our panel. Joining us now from Buffalo, New York is Lauren Fix. She's an automotive expert and editor-in-chief of Car Coach Reports. Also with us from Westfield, New Jersey via Skype is Dan Ives. He's the managing director and senior equity research analyst for Wedbush Securities. From Sunnyvale, California, Mark New covers Silicon Valley, high-tech companies, and reports on business ties between China and the United States for CGTN America. And Peter Suchu is a freelance writer who covers social media and technology from Detroit in Michigan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Peter, let me start with you. As I said, without a doubt, 2020 was the year of the pandemic. It dominated our lives and everything that we tried to do. The virus killed hundreds of thousands of people here in the United States. Millions more were infected. But it also pushed technology to the limits. We saw that we got a vaccine in record time, within a very short space of time after the United States government introduced Operation Warp Speed. But when we look at all the technologies that we used to fight the coronavirus pandemic, what were the technologies that had the most impact?
Well, I think the ability that we can contract trace, so that if you were exposed to the virus, contract tracing allowed those in your circle to know you were exposed. We certainly saw how that saved some of the professional sports. So that's one part of it. I think we're seeing technologies use unfold even now in how the vaccine's going to be delivered. The fact that the Pfizer vaccine needs to be kept at such extremely low temperatures. So technologies in play there, keeping it cold and ensuring it can be delivered safely.
Peter, as far as the vaccine is concerned, this was done in record time, in just a few months, really. It's taken other vaccines years to come to market. What was the technology that was used here, for the first time to bring this vaccine to market so quickly?
Well, just the fact that you had so many companies engaged in this. I think a lot of it was, to put it bluntly, the government throwing money at the problem. That's really, I think, the core of it, was the fact that the White House, the administration, dictated that we needed a vaccine as soon as possible, that the government would pay for this. When you throw money at a problem, it solves it pretty quickly.
Dan Ives, we know that businesses have had to change the way they operate over the past year. I mean, communications is now done via Zoom. In fact, we're doing part of the show using Skype, not the usual means that we use to communicate with guests around the world. Many people, of course, long to go back to normal. Will that ever happen, do you think? Will we ever get back to what it used to be like, perhaps just over a year ago?
Yeah, look, I think eventually we will, but in at least the next 12, 18 months, I still think work from home is going to be a trend. And that's why you talk about names like Zoom, Slack, Salesforce acquiring Slack. You look what's happening across the cloud shift. It's changed enterprise and governments, I think, from a paradigm perspective. And I think we will get to some sort of semi-normal. But I think from a technology perspective, it's why you see these stocks, a lot of them parabolic moves. It's really accelerated growth by 1 to 2 years across the tech landscape, as we've seen during this pandemic.
Dan, we have this conventional office model. We all go to work, or we used to all go to work in our offices and then leave in the evening to go back home. Do you think that'll ever come back? Because there are companies, I mean, you look at Facebook, for instance, which has decided that their workers will stay out, work from their homes, even after this pandemic is brought under control.
Oh yeah, I think as we get into second half of 2021, vaccine more to the masses, you'll start to see travel rebound, and ultimately, I think you'll start to see that return to the office, and especially much more normalized 2022. And I think the market, if you look, names like Uber, Lyft, rebound trade, some of these starting to really reflect in the market. And I think right now, from an investor perspective, it's a balance because between work from home and getting back to the office. But I do believe a year from now, if we're doing this right, we're doing it in studio, and I think we're getting more normalized just going into the summer, fall 2021.
Mark New, let's look at how people have entertained themselves over this past year. Of course, most people were confined to their homes. Warner Brothers, one of the big movie companies, announced that all of its 2021 movies will be streamed on HBO Max. Does this effectively mean the end of movie houses?
That's what the debate is about, and it's created a lot of resentment. For example, Christopher Nolan, the director of such movies as The Dark Knight and Inception, he said some of our industry's biggest filmmakers and most important movie stars went to bed the night before thinking they were working for the greatest movie studio and woke up to find out they were working for the worst streaming service. And he's referring to Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers owns HBO, so part of the thinking there is that they want to do this to bring it to home to increase their subscriptions. But as directors like Nolan say, the business model makes no sense, but at the same time, his movie Tenet, recently distributed by Warner Brothers, did not bring out the audiences. People just didn't want to risk their health coming to the theaters, and that's what the parent company, AT&T, and their CEO, John Stankey, has argued, that they want to be in theaters as much as possible, but they need to reach as many people right now, and you don't make money by having movies sit on a shelf. Anand.
All right, and Mark, talking about making money, are movie companies going to make as much money streaming their movies as they do when people actually go to, brick and mortar movie houses?
I don't think so, and they just have the subscriptions. The data so far doesn't show that many people have added HBO Max compared to make up that difference. But this is just the start of it, and Wonder Woman, for example, will be a big test. It debuted in China over the weekend, did not draw the audiences to the theaters, but in the U.S. it goes on Christmas Day. It launches at HBO Max and in theaters at the same time. And it's a different kind of business model because, for example, the director, Patty Jenkins, and also the star Gal Gadot have spoke fondly of this model so far, but they were actually paid about $10 million, at least reportedly, to sort of get on board with this, because they typically would get a percentage of those gross sales, from the box office tickets, and they have to be compensated for that in some way. So this is probably a good move to try and get them on board, public relations too. So this model, they're worried about doing long-term damage to the theater industry by trying to go to home so quickly, and this model, sort of the genie being pulled out to not be able to put back in the bottle. And on.
Right, okay, let's bring Lauren Fix into this conversation. Lauren, let's talk about the automobile industry in the United States. It's one of the biggest industries, it's one of the most important industries. If we look at car sales, according to JD Power, new car sales in April were off by 45% compared to the same period last year. But November sales saw a big rebound. It was almost back to what it was like the year before. How did the pandemic affect the automobile industry?
Oh, there was a huge impact on the auto industry. The shutdown of the industry was part of the problem, but then we also had a supply chain issue. A lot of components do come out of other countries, especially China, and with the slowdown and the different countries shutting down at different stages, this was a huge impact to the auto industry. They cannot produce a car that's 99% complete and sell it, so those vehicles sat, and many times companies would start the production and then have to stop. And so this caused not just a shortage in product being produced, but it also in sales. So what it also did is it created an impact on the used car industry and brought used car sales up between 10 and 15%, depending on whether you were talking about cars, SUVs, or trucks. Trucks having the biggest growth of 15% over what their value was previously. So it sort of messed up the automotive aftermarket as far as resale of vehicles. But so what you found is people maintaining their cars and keeping their cars and not trading them in. And an interesting thought of Last year we had 17.1 million vehicles sold, and that would be light trucks and cars and SUVs. But as people were getting their vehicles coming in off a lease, they were extending their leases, and that pushed back the potential sale into November, December, and next year. So you're going to see next year with a big growth. We're looking at possibly going as high as back to that 17 million sales, but this year will probably come in at 15.3 million light trucks. But there's a lot of impact still in play, with COVID, shutting down some cities. People aren't buying vehicles. They're afraid to go to dealerships. Maybe they don't have the product on the dealership floor. So those are big factors.
So, Lauren, given those challenges that you were talking to us about and the fact that, companies want to sell cars, would this be a good time to get into the market?
It's a good time to find a vehicle that's new if you can find one, particularly one that's 2021 or 2020 that's sitting on the lot. They're getting 2021s coming in. So if you're looking at buying a vehicle and you can't find what you're looking for, you may have to be a little bit more understanding of what's available. But if you can find a last year's model, you might be able to get a deal. There are minor incentives available, typically extensions on time window, not necessarily better pricing and incentives on lowering the price.
Right. Peter, we talked about Zoom earlier on. It's Apple's app of the year. It wasn't just business that used Zoom. Families used Zoom to visit virtually with each other. We had world leaders use Zoom for a virtual summit. How did Zoom change our lives? And do you think it's a kind of technology that will outlast this pandemic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we're seeing is we're seeing what's on everybody's bookshelves. So yeah, Zoom, Skype, these video over IP services, these are going to stick around. I think what we've seen is that, as was mentioned, the dynamic's going to change. Students are going to be able to take classes remotely. People are going to continue to work from home. I think in a few weeks, we're going to see a big game changer. As a tech journalist, normally I would be on an airplane in a few weeks to head to Las Vegas for CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. That's virtual this year. So we're going to be seeing these kind of events happening through services such as Zoom, Skype, and others.
Right, and so are costs going to come down? Say, for instance, for someone who wants to study at a university that's far away from them.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think we're going to see, maybe for some of those college students today, the idea of studying abroad, that might not happen as much. I think certainly in the near recovery into 2021, even into 2022, I don't think those programs are going to be available. So if you're a junior or senior in college and you were looking forward to this, I think the alternative is going to be studying at the Savant or another university, studying via Skype or Zoom. I think that's going to be the distance learning of the future.
Dan Ives, we all use technology. We like technology. We welcome the new technology that is introduced, but can video conferencing technologies like Zoom, like Skype, like Google Hangout, can they really replace the person-to-person contact, which we've been so used to in offices and at home for that matter?
I mean, no, it can. And that's why I think you're going to go back to some sort of semi-normal. You'll see growth moderate significantly in terms of Zoom, Slacks, and others. But no doubt, collaboration software, it's a fix in terms of what we're doing today and during the pandemic. And you're going to see that as a course of really more organizations, but it can't replace it. And that's why I think you're going to see a moderation. You'll see business travel start to resume. You talked about CES before, and I think it's a good example. When do conferences start to come back? Hopefully by later 2021 and 2022. But I do think it's going to be part of the new normal, but it's going to become, of course, a moderation from what we see today.
Right, Mark New, you are in Northern California. For much of the past decade, the San Francisco Bay Area has been struggling with growth because of things like high housing costs, gridlock, traffic gridlock. And we even have some companies that have moved out. Oracle has moved to Austin, Texas. Do you see more of that happening?
Certainly that's going to happen. The pandemic has certainly played a role in this, but this has been going on for some time. Surveys have repeatedly shown that people are tired of the traffic, the high cost of living, but Right now, during the pandemic, traffic is pretty good and prices have fallen down. So pandemic is contributing in other ways. Companies are also complaining about high taxes and also an unfriendly business environment. And Tesla's Elon Musk was a big one when he decided to move personally to Texas. He's of the more libertarian view that businesses need to stay out of our hair. He was in a big feud with the Fremont city government when they tried to shut down his factory production, and he really didn't want to comply with that and made a big fuss about that. The CEO of Dropbox moved earlier this year. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise moved to Oracle, moving their headquarters. And yes, the pandemic has contributed by creating a realization that work, especially for software developers, can be done remotely. So why not do it in a place that's a lot cheaper?
So Mark, high taxes, high housing costs, traffic gridlock, could that be perhaps one of the reasons why Facebook thought it's a good idea to have its engineers now work from home?
That is one reason, but they also were one of the first to cancel their conference, having some foresight that they did not want their staff to be at risk of spreading this disease. They somehow knew very early on. And also, their policy goes through July, Google's goes through June, and Mark Zuckerberg himself has predicted that throughout for the next decade, actually, that about half of his workforce, which right now is up to 52,000 people, will all be working from home.
Lauren, the auto industry, of course, is making that slow pivot towards electric cars. Is that shift, or did we see that shift gain any kind of momentum over the past year?
The biggest shift, I think, with electric vehicles was the demand from governments making that change. Consumers have not made that change. If you look at the total sales for this year so far and last year, less than 2% of total sales of 17.1 million are electric vehicles, which would be plug-ins. So even though California is mandating a shift, as some countries are also mandating the shift, consumers aren't going to do it without a huge incentive. So you do have this $7,500 tax credit. Tesla and General Motors do not have that available in the U.S. But then you're looking at a global basis, the biggest problem that we're running into is the infrastructure, having the chargeability, having charging stations, and then of course, people thinking that you're not going to use fossil fuels at all, and you're going to try and do it off of wind and solar. There's just not going to be enough power. So there's a lot of factors involved. It's sort of the chicken and the egg theory. It's great to have it, and the concept is there, but will it actually go into reality? And China is one of the biggest countries that is not making that transition at the rate they thought they would.
So insofar as the infrastructure is concerned, Lauren, the electric grids or electric power points that are needed, what are companies doing about that? I mean, we have a company like Tesla, which is making the cars, but are they also at the same time building these networks?
Well, he's building networks that you can only use with a Tesla. That's the problem. If you could plug in a Ford Mach-E, a Polestar, or a Hummer EV when they become available into the Tesla charging station, that might be great. There's no commonality. All the brands can use their own charging stations, like Charging America. There's a bunch of EV charging stations, but Tesla can use theirs, but you can't use Tesla. So that's part of the problem. So if you purchase a Tesla, there are limited charging stations. Remember that last year at this time, there was over an hour wait in California for people to get their cars charged. You don't have that kind of wait at a gas station. So until that infrastructure issue is in place, I think consumers are really afraid to make that transition. Even though they may not drive hundreds of miles a day, they still want that freedom to charge up and travel from New York to Florida or wherever they choose to go.
Right, absolutely. Peter, Tesla, of course, is riding a wave right now. It has a market capitalization of more than $600 billion. It's one of the top-selling electric auto brands. What is the future of the company? I mean, we know that Elon Musk has got his fingers in other businesses as well, space exploration being one of them. And one of the big businesses for Tesla is, of course, also is developing new battery technologies. But where do you see it going?
Exactly what was just said. I think it's going to be facing some hurdles in the coming years. The infrastructure just has to be resolved. And again, I'm going to agree. I don't see it being resolved until there's some standardization, some commonality between the charging stations. Until we get to that point, I think it's going to remain a niche product. The other thing is, I'm in the Midwest. My neighbors around here, and I realize I'm in, the Detroit area, hometown, they support that strongly here. My neighbors, my friends, they like their big SUVs, their big trucks. Tesla's not a big truck. It's not an SUV. It's going to have a hurdle to clear to capture that audience. I don't know how it's going to get the person that wants to go hunting, that has weekend projects and needs to haul some drywall. A Tesla's not the car for that audience.
Right. Lauren, one would think that standardizing these power points where you could charge your car, one would think that's a no-brainer, that it would just be standardized. You know, you could do it anywhere for any car.
Yeah. Well, we had that problem in the past with onboard diagnostics. There's a connection underneath the dash of every car from 1996 and newer. But previous to 96, there were multiple different connecting points. And the Society of Automotive Engineers, which I'm a member of, got together and said, we're going to standardize this. There's going to be one charging connection that everybody's going to use. And until that goes into play, I think it's going to be difficult to expand the reach for the average consumer. But there's still other hurdles that need to be cleared. We're still working with rare earth minerals. We have limited quantities. And as we build this great new technologies for batteries, we're still running into that wall of what are you going to do when these rare earth minerals like lithium, cobalt, cadmium, neodymium are gone?
Lauren, do you think other big companies, auto companies, companies like Toyota, Honda, VW, do you think they'll make that big switch to electric vehicles? Because at the moment it seems like they have one foot in old technology, which is gas-driven technology, and the other in new technology.
Well, some of them do have vehicles available. Nissan's been doing it for a long time with the Leaf. They were one of the first to come to market. It's a little bit of a funky looking vehicle, so it didn't really have a big take rate amongst consumers. But when you're looking at vehicles as a whole, they kind of have to, because the government is putting pressure on them that you have to offer something or you can't sell vehicles in California. So if that comes down to that, you're going to figure out a way to come in with a plug-in vehicle, whether people buy it or not. And the problem is, not one company, not even Tesla, makes $1 of profit. Tesla makes their money off of selling carbon credits to the companies that don't make plug-in vehicles and don't have enough carbon credits. So this is an interesting, situation. If people aren't buying them and they're not making profits, how are these companies going to stay in business when people want, as your other guest was saying, they want big SUVs and pickup trucks?
Right, Dan Ives, I'm going to look at the international picture for a moment. There is a trade war, as we are fully aware, going on between China and the United States. The latest salvo we saw was the United States restricting Chinese access to the semiconductor market here in the United States. How is this trade war and what's happening in the technology sector impacting the development of technology?
Well, first off, I think you've seen since the election, I think a Biden presidency is going to significantly ratchet down tensions between U.S. and China. And I think that cold tech war thesis maybe gets thrown out the window, which is why I think you've seen the market bullish for semiconductors, Apple and others. Look, it's a big issue because right now that's probably the biggest risk, in my opinion, from a supply chain overall tech perspective, which is why going forward, this is going to be a big focus of investors, especially on this U.S.-China tit for tat, what we're seeing on tech, because ultimately that continues to be the biggest risk to overall supply chain as well as just the broader tech ecosystem.
Because if you look at the market right now, say for something like semiconductors, China imports most of its semiconductors. What it produces domestically only meets about 30% of demand. So do you see that manufacturing capacity increase in China in the coming years?
Well, I do, and I think you're seeing that more decoupling, especially some of those 2025 initiatives within China. You're starting to see that decoupling. I think production could ramp up. We believe it could be 2x over the coming years, and that's what you're seeing across China. Not just on semis. You're seeing on EVs and other industries, and I think that's something that's really gotten the attention of investors in order to play this sort of decoupling trade, both in the U.S. as well as in China.
Mark New, much of this trade war, of course, is political. I mean, we've heard Donald Trump over the past 4 years talk about China taking away jobs from the United States. But if we look at some big corporations, let's take Apple, for instance. It manufactures its goods, its computers, its phones, etc. in China. Is that likely to change?
Most of the companies have been exploring ways to not be so dependent on China, and I've talked to a lot of different people involved in the ecosystem, and they say, yes, we don't want to have a reliance on it, but the fact is to try and change that system and go somewhere else and get that same high quality, that same speed is extremely difficult to replicate. So I think they still need to play ball in China, but at the same time, diversify, but they're never going to fully be able to pull out because there's just too much reliance and efficiency in China.
Right, that infrastructure is already in place there. Peter, one other impact of the pandemic, I mean, given the lockdowns that was brought about by the coronavirus, people have turned to streaming apps for their entertainment, things like Netflix, Peacock, Apple TV, and Hulu. Do you see these platforms continue to grow as we get to grips with the pandemic? And what would that mean for the sort of conventional cable industry in the United States?
I don't think there's any question. I think in 10 years, the companies that are involved in cable, satellite TV, the Comcast, the Charter, Time Warner, Dish, those companies are already pivoting to new markets. I think we're already seeing with Comcast, it's less about being a cable provider and really being that internet provider to supply the highway for these streaming services. So I don't think there's any question at all. I think we're going to see the streaming services are going to completely displace it. And I think that industry is going to evolve as well. I think there's a lot of changes we'll see. I think certainly with HBO Max, they did an interesting thing with their shows such as The Flight Attendant, where instead of providing all of the episodes up front for a binge weekend, they're rolling them out on a week-by-week basis. That was something that was actually pioneered with Hulu with some of its premiere programming, such as The Handmaid's Tale. So I think we're going to see more of that evolution. So I think in the coming years, the Hulus, the Netflix, the Amazons, they're going to be the new premium channels, sort of displacing those HBO, Showtimes, which are going to become alternative streaming services as well. So the whole industry is going to be in flux for the next couple of years.
Lauren, one more thing about cars. I mean, we've been talking for a long time about self-drive vehicles, autonomous vehicles. This was the fantasy world that we were going to be living in. How far are we away from that?
I think we're quite a bit farther away than you actually realize. There's 5 factors that are holding up autonomous cars. Of course, the government regulations, they don't want steering wheels or pedals. To me, that's an amusement ride, and I can't see the average person jumping in to a pod and taking off. That's great in the Jetsons, but in reality, it's not there because there's so many other factors. You've got the insurance companies and the reinsurance companies who do not want to insure this because who's at fault? There's way too many issues involved. Then you've got the hackers. There's still no firewall that can be produced today that keeps out these people that are looking to do harm to us. And if you've got us all on one grid, which we need with 5G, that's going to be a problem. And the biggest one, besides the consumers not really ready for this because they shut off a lot of that technology, the biggest one is weather. We cannot control weather. And I live in Buffalo, New York, we have snow. And also one of your panelists is in Detroit. When snow hits, you could leave in the morning and be fine and be stuck at work and no way to go home because the car could say it's unsafe in the computer's thought. And right. You may say, well, I drive in snow all the time. These are all factors that are definitely going to stop autonomous vehicles from happening. Okay,
and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of the show. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.